In this video here, we're going to take a look at resource histograms. Now, one important consideration when working on a project is the number of workers needed to complete a project. And you will always be told the number of workers that are needed for each activity. And workers must follow these three rules. So, for the first rule here, we say that no worker can carry out more than one activity simultaneously. For the second rule, we say that once a worker or workers have started an activity, they must complete it. And then finally, for the very last rule here, once a worker or workers have finished an activity, they immediately become available to start another activity. Now, a resource histogram is useful as it shows us the number of workers that are active at any given time. Now, the convention when constructing a diagram is to assume that each activity starts at the earliest time possible. However, once we've drawn our histogram, it may be possible to use a diagram to identify which activities may be delayed in order to minimize the number of workers required. And in some situations, the number of workers available is less than the number required to complete the project in the minimum possible time. So the start and finish times of some activities may have to be delayed in order to meet this constraint. And as a result, this then extends the time needed for project completion. So the process of adjusting the start and finish times of the activities in order to take into account constraints on the resource is what we call resource leveling. And one way to draw a resource histogram is to start from a Gantt chart. So let's just take a look then at how we can draw a resource histogram. So let's just get started then with this practice question here. Now the network below shows the activities that need to be undertaken to complete a project. Now each activity is represented by an arc, as we can see here, and the duration in hours of the corresponding activity is shown in brackets again, as we can see here, right? And this is a concept then that we should be very much familiar with by now. What I've also got here is this table. So the table below here also lists the number of workers required for each activity in the project. So as we can see then, in the left-hand column here, I've got all the different activities. So A, B, C, so on and so on, all the way through to H. And then in the right-hand column here, the number of workers required for each respective activity. What I'm also told here is that each worker is able to complete any of the activities. And once an activity has been started, it must be completed without interruption. We're then given that each activity must begin at its earliest possible start time. So all we want to do here for this question then is using the given grid, draw a resource histogram to show the number of workers required at each time. Now you're probably looking at the question here and thinking, where is the given grid? And that's a good question. Now, there is a reason why I've not put it on the screen just yet. And that reason then is because what I need to do here is just begin then by finding the early and late event times. Now, in the interest of saving time here, I'm not going to go through the full network in detail, explain how to find the early and late event times. If you want to learn how to do that, just go back a couple of videos. We have covered this in quite a bit of detail. But for this video then, all I'll do here is just complete the early and late event times. So starting off then, we've got 0, 0 here. I've got 3, 4. I've got 8, 9, and 7, 7. Then for the final 4 values here, I get 9, 10. And then finally here, 11, 11. Okay. So these values here then give us the early and late event times. Now, on the actual exam question, as you can see here, this is from D1 June 2023. The question is actually structured in such a way that I think it's part A of the question here. All it wants you to do then is just find the early and late event times for the network. Clearly, for this question here, I'm more concerned about the resource histogram as opposed to actually find the early and late event times. Obviously, in an exam, they structure the question in such a way to actually help you answer the later parts of the question, if that makes sense. Anyway, I'm kind of waffling, but that's the first part of this question here complete that we need anyway. So, like we said, all we need here to begin with is the early and late event times. So, this here then will be my given grid. So all we want to do here then is just draw a resource histogram to show the number of workers required. I can't speak. The number of workers required at each time. So as we can see then along the horizontal axis here, that is the time in hours. And then for the vertical axis here, that represents the number of workers. So to begin with here, we don't have to, but I do think it's a good practice to do here, is to begin with the critical path, right? So as I can see then, I'll do this in a different color just so you can see it a little bit better. My critical path here will be the following. So we go from here, the source node, to here. Then we go from here, here. So DG here just represents the critical path, right? So what I'm going to do here to begin with is just start with the critical path along the base of our resource histogram, right? Or along the base of the horizontal axis, I should say. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but once I start drawing it, it will make sense, I promise. So in that case then, what I can see here is my critical activities then are D and G. Now activity D then, where is that? That requires 2 workers, so workers required is 2. So it'll be here on the vertical axis. And then in terms of the time here, in hours of course, well the duration here is 7. So this is my height here, and we go along to 7. Okay, clearly this should just be a straight line. I'm doing it freehand. That is shocking. I'm going to redo that. That's that bad. I'll try again. So I'm doing this without a ruler. I'm doing it freehand. You can certainly make yours look better than mine. It doesn't need to be perfect, but, you know, something reasonable, that will do. Obviously, draw the bar here, like so. So this here then is activity D, okay? I will then put D then inside the rectangle here, just to indicate that this is actually activity D. Perfect. What I'll do as well is I'll give it a tick here as I go, just to indicate that we've already done activity. Perfect. And then, as we just mentioned here, the next critical activity is activity G. So activity G requires 1 worker. So our height here is 1. Now, in terms of the duration then, well, that's 4 hours. So we go from 7 to 11 here. Okay. Like so. Perfect. And this here then is activity G. And again, we'll just indicate that by writing down the letter G inside the rectangle. Perfect. So let's give activity G a tick as well. Good stuff. Now, what we're going to do here is start with A and C, right, for the next part. Okay. So we always start with the earliest possible start time, as it tells us here in the question. Now, in terms of how we structure these activities, this is where students can struggle. The key thing here is that we want to avoid overhang where possible. Okay. So your first thought here might be to draw A first and then put C on top. However, if I was to do that here, if you just notice then the duration of C here is 4, the duration of A is 3. If I put A underneath and then C on top, then clearly C will overhang A, right? And I don't want that. So what I'll do here is I'll put C on top. Now, how many workers are required here for C, right? So C also requires 2 workers. So I'll go up to 4, like so. And it has a duration of 4. So we go from here with this height to 4, like so. Bring that up here. So this here then represents activity C. I'll give that a tick as well as we go. And then for activity A here, as we just mentioned before, right? So again, that requires 2 workers. So that will go from 4 to 6. And as I mentioned before, if I do it in this way, we avoid any overhangs, so that's clearly what we want, right? What is the duration here for A? It has a duration of 3 hours. So we go across here to 3. Oops, that's not very good. I'm going to redo that. Seriously, trying to do this freehand is not the easiest. It's much, much easier when you have a ruler. There we go. It's not too bad. And this here then is activity A. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to give it a tick here as well as I go along my diagram, just so I can kind of see visually what I've already done here. So next then will be activity B. Now, activity B then has a duration of 5. Now, it only requires 1 worker here, so that's quite good in terms of kind of fitting this on. But the duration here of 5 would mean then, if I try and put this on just 1 line here, we're going to get overhang. So what I'm going to do here is basically split this up into 3 sections. So I can get 1 hour here, like so. I can get 1 hour there. I can then get 3 hours here. So don't forget that it only requires 1 worker here for activity B, like so. I can get another 3 hours there. And then clearly at this point here, we just require now 1 further hour, if that makes sense. So I've got 1 hour here, 3 hours here. So that's 4 hours, but the total duration for B is 5 hours. So But my final hour here, I'm going to put that at the very bottom here. And in doing it in this way here, what this does then is this avoids any overhang here, right? And that's the key thing, right? If possible, we want to avoid overhang. So perfect, that gives us activity B here. I'll give that a tick as well on my diagram. So at this point here, then the question is nearly complete, right? To finish with then, what we're missing here from our resource histogram, we're missing activities E, F, and H here. So as we can see from the activity network here, E and F both have the same earliest possible start time. So what that means then is there's two different ways that we can draw this. What I could do here would be to put E and H on top of G and then put F on top of E and H, if that makes sense. Or alternatively, what we could also do here would be to draw F on top of G and then just do the same as what we kind of did before, but now put E and H on top of F. Now, either of these ways is fine. What I'll do here is I'll put F on top of G and then put E and H on top of F. I think that's probably the nicest way to do this. But again, either way is absolutely fine here. So for activity F then, as we can see here, it starts at 8, right? And it has a duration of 2. And how many workers are required here? So we require 2 workers for activity F. So we're going to go from 1 to 3 here, like so. And we have a duration of 2. So we go from 8 to 10 here. Perfect. Okay, so this here then is activity F. I'll give that a tick here as well. And then as we just mentioned, right, we're going to put activity E and activity H here on top of F. So activity E here requires 3 workers and activity E starts at 8. So starts at 8 here. And it requires 3 workers. So we go from 3 to 6. Okay. So I'll add that on like so. What is the duration here for activity E? That's just 1 hour. So we go from 8 to 9 here. Okay. So this here then is activity E. Like so. And then finally here, sorry, I'll just give these a tick as well. I did forget to do this on my diagram. So E and F. And then finally, as we can see here from our activity network, we're nearly done, right? Just activity H here to finish with. So activity H then, again, that starts at 9 here. That starts here. And it also has a duration of 1. Okay. So if I do this here, like so, we've now added activity H here onto our resource histogram. And at this point here, just give that a tick as well. This here is, I'm going to say perfect. The only thing that's not perfect here is my art skills. I'm doing it freehand, like I said before, so please do use a ruler on an actual exam. Just make it look a little bit neater than mine. But other than that, it's perfect. So not bad, right? And there we have it. So this here is the solution to the 1 practice question for this video. And that brings the end then of this video here on resource histograms.